Seltzer Kings.
Podcasts.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
On WhatsApp, no one can see or hear your personal messages. Whether it's a voice call, message, or sending a password. To WhatsApp, it's all just this. So whether you're sharing the streaming password in the family chat or trading those late-night voice messages that could basically become a podcast, your personal messages stay between you, your friends, and your family. No one else. Not even us. WhatsApp. Message privately with everyone.
Hi, pod friends. Just checking in to remind you that this is a rerun because Summer Series 2025, You Can Have a Little War, as a treat, kicks off on July 14th. Here at the Podcast Hut, we are busy researching and writing, if you know what I mean.
It means everybody drink.
Duh, it's Independence Day. Of course we're drinking. So here is this rerun from 2023 about the first Gulf War. You see, it fits both the Summer Series theme, and I was thinking, what better way to celebrate what might be the last of America's birthday than by talking about one of her many wars. So, enjoy this Megamix of episodes number 393 and 394 about the first Persian Gulf War. And we'll see you all next week for part 1 of Summer Series 2025. Oh, absolutely, Gavin. We could not have won the war without the Royal Army and the Royal Air Force. You guys were the only people in the AOR that had any beer. The fighting, not so much. Ass.
The following podcast contains
all the sex, violence, swearing, and farts intact.
Explicit language.
Hello and welcome to the podcast that asks a simple question. When you thought the end of the Cold War meant global peace, what the hell were you thinking? I'm your host, Dave Bledsoe, and this is episode number 393, A Feel-Good War, part 1 of Operation Desert Storm edition of the show. We talk about that time we went to war just for the vibes. Stay tuned. What the Hell We Thinking podcast is brought to you by Secondhand Booms, your source for pre-owned military hardware. Are you a developing nation with a big need for weapons but only a small budget to buy? Are you a despot unfairly blacklisted from the international arms market? Secondhand Booms is the solution to your arsenal issues. Our equipment is older, gently used, and excellently maintained. From rifles to armored vehicles, from air defenses to anti-ship weapons, Secondhand Booms has what you need to equip your militia, guerrilla band, or Revolutionary Guard, all at great prices. Be able to go up against American Special Forces? No. You can definitely dominate your neighbors and your citizens just fine. Secondhand Booms. Our guns aren't new, but you know what? They'll do.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak. Ground forces are not engaged. This conflict started August 2nd, when the dictator of Iraq invaded a small and helpless neighbor. Kuwait, a member of the Arab League and a member of the United Nations, was crushed. Its people brutalized. 5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
It's no great secret, but I'll repeat it here for posterity. I never wanted to join the military.
And yet,
I found myself spending a decade in said military. A lot of military brats wind up enlisting in the military. People like to talk about a family of service, generations answering the call, a proud tradition of patriotism, but you know what?
Total bullshit.
A lot of military brats find themselves in the service simply because there's no other option. When you grow up in the life is all you know. You're no more prepared to be in a civilian life than you are to be on an Amish farm. And if you thought otherwise, well,
Look, I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings.
An article in the Military Times published in 2021 said that 2/3 of military brats planned on serving in the military. Those are numbers that do not lie. Your world is what you know. Military brats, no military life. This isn't to say I was forced to enlist. I was simply informed that I would need to do something once I graduated high school, that I should consider this the last call for the parental gravy train.
You don't have to go home, but you can stay here.
So, since I was an apathetic slacker who had no fucking clue what to do with his life that didn't involve working the window at a Taco John's drive-thru, I thought,
sign me up.
And went looking for the branch of service where it was least likely that I might ever be placed in combat. And I thought to myself, why not aim high?
America. It's a great country. Protecting it is a great way of life. The United States Air Force. Find out how you can be part of it. Aim high. Air Force.
Also, my dad was in the Air Force, so it was pretty much the only option. So, anyway, I joined up and naturally found myself in the only fucking job in the goddamn Air Force where I might be placed in a combat situation.
You a pilot?
Oh, God, no. I'm talking about enlisted. I was an Air Force cop, which is the closest thing to being infantry in a service that doesn't have infantry. Still, at the time, it didn't seem like a bad idea. It was abundantly clear by the late 1980s when I enlisted that this whole Cold War thing was all but over, and my chances of ever going to war seemed laughably small. After all, who was going to fight the winner of the Cold War? Fuck yeah! There was a little tiff down in Panama, but that was more of a drug raid in the war, and I figured I can ride this last year out of my time in uniform in stateside peacetime comfort. And all in all, I thought it worked out really well for me. And then, this jackass named Saddam decided to fuck up my plans for a nice, easy life. What an asshole. Which brings me to my topic this week. 32 years ago, the week this podcast is released, combat operations began in Operation Desert Storm.
Aw, cute!
For those of us living in the shadow of Second Bush's war in the desert, Desert Storm seems like far off, maybe even quaint. It was, after all, 6 weeks of bombing and 100 hours of tanks driving around shooting shit, and then some parades, which I have to say is exactly what it was. The whole thing was kind of like something to wash the lingering bitterness of that whole Vietnam War thing from our national psyche. It's a bit of a, I don't know, what's the word?
Palate cleanser?
Yeah, exactly, a palate cleanser. The kind of thing that can make America feel tough again. So, let's dig into Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, our feel-good war from 1991. Where do I even begin with this story? I mean, I could go all the way back and explain why the Middle East is so fought over in the first place.
How about no?
Yeah, good point. We covered that in episode 349, Gas, No One Rides for Free. Well, then I could start with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I.
Too early.
Good point. Okay, what about the partition of the Middle East after World War II?
Skipped the end.
All right, well, I guess the real reason was that George Herbert Walker Bush was widely considered to be a big pussy.
Now we're talking.
Which is strange because Poppy Bush was a decorated naval flyer who flew 58 missions and was shot down during World War II. George H.W. Bush was many things.
He's a war criminal.
But not a pussy. What he was a patrician, a Yale-educated Ivy League elite who had been in government for decades and had been the director of the CIA, which was why Ronald Reagan...
He said it!
Yeah, I'm going to say Reagan a lot during this episode. No need to repeat that. That's why he tapped George to be his running mate, because Ron knew fucking all about foreign policy, and Bush was a wonk. When George stood next to Ronnie, the strapping image of American manhood with his dyed hair and his makeup, he came across as rather less than rugged. So much that when George announced his candidacy for president in 1987, Newsweek magazine ran a cover emblazoned with "Bush battles the wimp factor." Why did they do this? Well, I'm not making this up. A comic strip called him one.
Nobody gives a shit about Doonesbury. Now, come on, chop, chop.
Yeah, Doonesbury. Now, today, that seems a little strange that this Doonesbury comic strip could belittle a man like George H.W. Bush. But back in the day, being in a Doonesbury strip was basically being the Twitter main character of the time. And what did Doonesbury say about Poppy? Quoting from a Rolling Stone article, quote, cartoonist Gary Trudeau had newsman character Roland Headley Jr. doing a stand-up outside the White House announcing in a White House ceremony today, Bush will formally place his embattled manhood in a blind trust, unquote.
Oh, snap.
And so it became George's solemn mission to prove to America, the world, maybe himself, that he was a manly man, and if a lot of brown people had to die, well, that's just politics, baby. He had his first shot not long after he took office when Manuel Noriega, the president of Panama, who absolutely was definitely engaged in drug smuggling and money laundering for the Colombian cartels.
But he also works for the CIA.
Shh, we don't talk about that. We're never supposed to mention that part. Anyway, Manuel had slipped his leash and was doing all sorts of shit down in Panama. Some American service members got killed, so Poppy sent in the military in a massive invasion of a sovereign nation by the United States without international sanction. The result was 23 dead GIs, most of which came from friendly fire, 1,000 or so dead Panamanians, mostly civilians, and one of the most heavy metal standoffs you've ever heard when U.S. forces played heavy metal music over loudspeakers to drive Manuel Noriega out of the Vatican embassy where he was holed up. The entire playlist, including Judas Priest, Van Halen, Twisted Sister, and Ozzy Osbourne, is preserved for posterity in a YouTube playlist called from none other than the National Security Archives up on YouTube. It fucking rocks, and you damn well know I included it in the show notes. Now, you would think this would be enough for George's dick to feel big again. I mean, after all, Ronnie got his stiffy up by invading a small Caribbean island to rescue a couple of dozen medical students and kill some Cubans. But a few months later, a bigger and better dick pill would be handed to Poppy, all gift-wrapped.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, at this hour, Iraq remains in firm control of the tiny oil-rich country of Kuwait, and there is no indication that those Iraqi troops, some 100,000 of them, will be leaving soon. They invaded Kuwait last night, United States time, in the middle of the night, Kuwaiti time, and they have taken control of that tiny country, which was not prepared to defend itself, of course. It only has about 20,000 troops altogether. It's about the size of New Jersey. And Iraq, a battle-tested country, is led by a man by the name of Saddam Hussein. He has grand designs for his own personal empire, and, of course, he badly needs the oil revenue of that country.
Yeah, on August 2nd, 1990, Iraq decided now would be a good time to, just slip over the border into their neighbor Kuwait and kind of take it over. Now, there are several reasons why Iraq thought this would be a good idea, some of them based on how things were chopped up post-World War II, some based on tribal relations. There might have been even one or two Kuwaiti royals who stood to benefit from Iraq doing this, but the big reason came down to two things. The first thing was Iraq owed Kuwait $14 billion in loans from the Iran-Iraq war that they didn't want to pay, and secondly, Kuwait was definitely drinking Iraq's milkshake.
If you have a milkshake, and I have a milkshake, and I have a straw, there it is, that's a straw, you see. Watching. My straw reaches across the room and starts to drink your milkshake. I drink your milkshake.
By slant drilling into Iraqi oil deposits. It was the sort of thing that really should have been settled diplomatically, but Saddam got a Saddam, so he just up and invaded. And look, this sort of thing happens. I mean, it's unfortunate. Well, it's unfortunate for the Kuwaitis in a way. It's pretty swell if you're an Iraqi, I guess. And what would usually happen is there would be a bunch of angry words, some threats. They'd be speeches on the floor of the United Nations. The U.S. State Department would hold a press conference, and the president would dodge some questions at a press conference. But eventually, things would shake out to the usual status quo. After all, Saddam was our guy. A brutal dictator, to be sure, but he was our brutal dictator. We'd propped him up for decades in a proxy war against Iran and flooded him with all sorts of cool rockets and bombs. Eventually, some sort of compromise would be reached with Iraq getting their loans forgiven and the Kuwaiti government quietly being repaid by the United States on the sly. And the Iraqis would go home. This is what Saddam thought would happen. Hell, it's what the Kuwaitis thought would happen. Except, there was this tiny little inconvenience. This whole wimp factor.
In this particular case, Saddam Hussein had challenged and questioned the size of George Bush's dick. And George Bush has been called a wimp for so long. Wimp rhymes with limp. George has been called a wimp for so long that he has to act out his manhood fantasies by sending other people's children to die.
So, clearly something had to be done. So Poppy got on the phone and called up old family friend King Fahd, the king of Saudi Arabia. From an article on www.norton.com, quote, Bush telephoned King Fahd directly on the first day of the invasion, and the U.S. leader insisted that Iraq had to withdraw. The king sounded uneasy about the invasion and agreed that ultimately Iraq, they would have to pull out. However, when Bush offered to send a squadron of F-15 fighter craft as a sign of U.S. support, King Fahd hesitated and asked Bush for further discussions. Bush was afraid that the Saudis would not be willing to resist. In Bush's words, the king's hesitations rang alarm bells in my head, unquote. And look, the king might have had some good reasons to be a little hesitant since the United States had this habit of,
That's why you promised me shit you couldn't deliver.
More from that same article, quote, as it turned out, much of King Fahd's hesitation was based on their interpretation of past U.S. actions. In 1979, when the Shah of Iran was overthrown, the United States offered Saudi Arabia a squadron of F-15s as a sign of support. The monarchy accepted the U.S. offer immediately, and when the planes were already in flight, the Saudis, who learned publicly that the aircraft were unarmed, felt betrayed. The fact that Bush, following military plans, made the same offer to Fahd probably set off alarm bells for the Saudi monarch as well. The king also had underlying concerns about the U.S. staying power in the region. In the early 1980s, during the Reagan administration, U.S. Marines were sent to Beirut, Lebanon to stabilize the country, but were withdrawn after a terrorist attack against those Marines. Those two concerns shaped the Saudi monarch's initial hesitancy, unquote. In the end, it would take the work of none other than one Dick Cheney, who was pulling the strings as Secretary of Defense at the time, to convince the Saudis to let us in by showing some satellite imagery of a purported Iraqi buildup on the border with Saudi Arabia.
How convenient.
The exiled Iraqi government official Saad al-Bazaz claimed in a 1996 book that Saddam planned to continue into Saudi Arabia as soon as a week after the invasion of the Kuwait, according to an AP article in 1996. Quote, according to the excerpts published Monday, Saddam ordered his forces to ready an assault on Saudi Arabia's oil-rich eastern provinces. Al-Bazaz said the Iraqi leader ordered the elite Republican Guard to be ready to launch an offensive on August 11th, 1990, 9 days after the invasion of Kuwait. The invasion plans call for 4 divisions or 120,000 troops to thrust into the desert to capture the oil fields more than 180 miles away, Al-Bazaz contends. The plans worked out by the commander of the guards at the time, Lieutenant General Ayad Fatah al-Rawi, called for a 3-pronged attack that would have soldiers reach the oil fields in 10 hours, Al-Bazaz said. Everything was set for the Saudi invasion, awaiting the H hour to be decided by Saddam.
So what happened?
Later, al-Bazaz said Saddam canceled the Saudi invasion plans and ordered troops to concentrate instead on fortifying their positions in Kuwait. No one can determine what forced him to change his mind, he said. That is a secret, which only Saddam knows, unquote. Or, far more likely, based on what we learned about the state of the Iraqi army, Iraq simply lacked the ability to invade Saudi Arabia and subsequently hold on to Kuwait. The troops that Cheney said were stationed on the Saudi border lacked the ability to carry out any kind of offensive operations and were there to be seen by satellites they knew were overhead watching. Now, look, it might seem your humble pod host might be coming across as a bit cynical, perhaps even a touch
Fucking un-American.
The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was bad, all right? Anytime another nation invades the sovereign nations on flimsy pretexts to satisfy the desire of a weak leader, it's a fucking disgrace. Like the United States did about 12 years later on the orders of this president's son, who was now president, and was feeling that he needed a dick lift.
He has a point.
And considering the exact same motherfuckers were in charge in 1990 as were in charge in 2003, you're just going to have to forgive me for having some doubts about the veracity of the causes belli given by our government. And if you want to say, well, what about...
Oh, like the United Nations?
I mean, didn't they say it was okay? Yeah, I guess the Security Council passed Resolution 678, which gave Iraq until 15 January 1991 to withdraw from Kuwait and empowered the states to use all necessary means to force Kuwait out after the deadline. Yeah, that's true. But again, I have to point out what was really happening wasn't democracy or freedom. Iraqis still in incubators from Kuwaiti preemies, leaving the preemies to die on the floor of the hospital. That didn't even happen. It was on the news, but it never fucking happened. What had happened was one simple fucking thing.
Oil, that is. Black gold. Texas tea.
Quoting now from Wikipedia, quote, one of the main concerns in the Western world was the significant threat Iraq posed to Saudi Arabia. Following Kuwait's conquest, the Iraqi army was within easy striking distance of Saudi oil fields. Control of these fields, along with Kuwait and Iraqi reserves, would have given Saddam control of the majority of the world's oil reserves. Iraq also had a number of grievances with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis had lit some $26 billion during the war with Iran, and the Saudis had backed Iraq in that war as they feared the influence of Shia's Iran Islamic Revolution on its own Shia minority. After the war, Saddam felt that he should not have to repay the loans due to the help he had given the Saudis by fighting Iran, unquote. So it was that Operation Desert Shield, a wholly defensive operation that would place over 500,000 troops, 400,000 of them American, the remainder of coalition, inside Saudi Arabia in a purely defensive, not at all invasion going to happen sort of way, just in case to be sure, as a hedge against a further Iraqi aggression. Now, imagine you are a 21-year-old guy named Dave, and you're just kicking it in San Antonio, going to bomb dog school before heading over to a new assignment in Korea with just over a year left in your enlistment.
Why would I do that?
It builds dramatic tension. Now, here I was feeling pretty damn good. Everything was lining up nicely for me, my future. I could do my last year, get out of the military, and head off to a life of, well, I still didn't have a fucking clue, but at that time, at least I was going to get out of the service. And then I turned on the news one afternoon and I heard,
we're going to fucking war.
And I was like, what?
Did he say what I think he said?
We were, in fact, going to war. I want to point out a very important fact that I think eludes a lot of people. Like I said, I didn't want to join the military, and I definitely did not want to go to war. I joined because my parents told me I had to get a fucking job. And I thought, I could make some money, go to college or something. Even if we went to war, well, I was in the Air Force. So if there was a war, I reasonably assumed it would be a nuclear war, meaning I was exactly the same amount of fucked as everyone else. No big deal. But this wasn't like that. Oh, no. This was an old-fashioned war. And I had learned enough about what Air Force cops did in Vietnam to know that I had no place doing any kind of shit like that because...
A bloke was telling me, if you're in the army and there's a war, you have to go and fight.
That's true.
Well, blimey, if it was a big war, somebody could be hurt.
Watkins, why did you join the army?
For the water skiing and for the travel, sir. Not for the killing, sir. I asked them to put it on my form, sir. No killing.
Watkins, are you a pacifist?
No, sir, I'm not a pacifist, sir. I'm a coward.
I mean, I could go either way on pacifism and a coward, but what's important was I was dubious about the whole thing from the beginning. That's when it happened. I talked to my dad. Do you have any idea what my fucking dad told me?
Clearly not.
He told me not to worry about it. You might wonder why this offended me. Well, I'm going to tell you. The reason I didn't have to worry about it is that he was going to go to war, and since a father and son could not be in a war zone at the same time, I had nothing to worry about because he would be the one to go. Now, I'm not a fucking hero or anything, but, this bothered me because my dad had already gone to war before he was actually in Vietnam, and since he had done that, it didn't seem right that he would have to go to another war at all. And I told my dad, well, that's bullshit, that if anyone was going to go to war this time, well, it just had to be me. And you know what he fucking did to me?
Again, no.
He fucking pulled rank on me. Not as like my dad, because I'm fucking 21 years old. What's that going to do? No, he pulled rank on me in the military sense because he was an officer and I was an enlisted. So he ordered me to shut the fuck up, go to Korea, and sit out the war drinking soju and mess around with Korean working girls.
Not in so many words.
But that effectively was what he was saying. I was pissed. was legit pissed. I in no way, again, I didn't want to go to war, but if someone had to go to war, reasonably, it should have been me. You know what happened?
For the last time. No.
Yeah, he went to Saudi Arabia, I went to Korea, drank soju, and messed around with Korean working girls.
Thank you for your service.
Of course, dumbass me, I never once thought about how my dad, as an administrative officer in a support position, was never going to be on the front lines of anything other than maybe the chow hall, and my dumbass might actually stand some small risk being in danger. It was the Air Force after all, so the choice was actually really simple, logical, and here's the rub, promotable for my dad and not for me. You see, he stood to gain rank if he went over. Well, I didn't. He wasn't being a hero either. I mean, he definitely didn't want me in harm's way, but he also knew that his odds were exponentially better than mine of coming through this fine, and mine were already really good. You want to know what the really bitter irony of all this was?
Just tell us, bitch.
He got fucked over. He had to leave the Air Force, and unlike me, he loved the Air Force. What happened was all the pilots got promotions, and regardless of what they actually did, and officers like my dad were passed over and forced out on the drawdown that came after the war. All things considered, he should have just let me go, because in hindsight, the risk I was taking of going over there was actually equivocal to the case of the crabs I got in Korea, which were itchy, but hardly worthy of a Purple Heart. Now, most of you will remember that when Bush Jr. did this little shit show in 2003, most people were down with the clown when it came to going back to Iraq. There were plenty of reasons for this.
All the lies.
Yep, that and that whole 9/11 thing that we were lied about. In 1990, there was no reason for Americans to support a war. I guess maybe gas prices, but there wasn't really a major spike after the invasion of Kuwait. Logically, Americans would demand some kind of reason for all the money and troops suddenly being poured into a country that had nothing to do with the U.S. and had frequently been a thorn in our side. Surely, there must have been some protest, right?
Wrong, 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 wrong.
Nah, America was stoked to go to war. The country had a giant hard-on with a yellow ribbon tied around the dick. We didn't start out that way. In the early days of the crisis, people were not at all sure that the wimpy guy in the White House had the gonads to stand up to mean old Saddam. From an article entitled War Policy, Public Support of the Media by William N. Darley, quote, in the months immediately following Iraq's 1990 invasion of Kuwait, the public approval rating for then President George H.W. Bush's handling of the war declined from 76% for approval in August 1990 to 54% in October 1990. The decline was widely interpreted, but even by those in the White House, as a reflection of public dissatisfaction of a growing perception of seemingly ineffectual policies in response to Saddam Hussein's continued occupation of Kuwait, unquote. But as the troops began to flow into the Gulf and the rhetoric out of the White House became increasingly bellicose, people began to rally around the flag. Now, back in those days, if you wanted to take the temperature of the public, Saturday Night Live used to be a pretty solid thermometer. This was the cold open for December 15th, 1990.
400,000 brave Americans await my order to annihilate Iraq. And none of us want war in that whole area out over there. But as Commander-in-Chief, I am ever cognizant of my authority to launch a full-scale orgy of death there on the desert sand. Probably won't. But then again, I might. Now, if we do go to war, I can assure you it will not be another Vietnam, because we have learned, well, the simple lesson of Vietnam: stay out of Vietnam.
It was a fucking national obsession. This cannot be another Vietnam. Everyone was like, we can't make the same mistakes we did in Vietnam, which is ironic because the first and biggest mistake was getting into Vietnam in the first place when no one had the time for rational thinking. America was ready to chew bubble gum and kick ass, and look, all the stores were out of bubble gum. You might be wondering why America was all of a sudden so fucking bloodthirsty. Well, it's simple. We saw it on CNN. CNN was still relatively new in 1990 when the crisis kicked off, and CNN went balls deep on war coverage. They rushed reporters to the Gulf, including Baghdad, and during the build-up, CNN would feature breathless videos of troops arriving in Saudi Arabia by the thousands as khaki-clad reporters did stand-ups on the flight line. Back in the studio, endless spots featured retired generals talking about the awesome power of the Iraqi military and whispering dire warnings of Iraq's chemical weapons stockpiles and how the elite,
but the Republican Guard is still out there,
was going to be fucking everywhere. By the time the war started, the Republican Guard were regularly portrayed as 10-foot-tall, bulletproof super soldiers that ate lead and shit bullets. America was riveted to the war, and that meant America was riveted to CNN. It was a ratings bonanza. So, of course, CNN was going to run more and more war coverage. War was good for business, and CNN and every other TV network had a vested interest in cheerleading the war. The idea of journalistic integrity, well, that was for newspapers and magazines. You see, what we need is more wolf blitzers standing on a sand dune. And when the war finally kicked off, these fuckers actually got a goddamn nickname.
Arthur Kent, or, as he's now known, Arthur the Scud Stud.
And you cannot run 24-hour coverage of uncritical propaganda and not have an influence on how people feel about the war. And all of that propaganda was working. Again, from the Darley Report, quote, those approving of his handling of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait rose 24 points. Those approving of the way he was handling the Iraq situation rose 28 points. Those approving of the job he was doing as president rose 18 points. Those trusting him to make the right decisions on war went up 20 points. These indices generally remained high throughout the war, and Bush's popularity took another bolt upward to a phenomenal 89% through March of 1991, unquote. And yes, pod friends, the war was popular, but most importantly, the war was marketed.
Merchandising, where the real money from the movie is made.
I mean, why wouldn't it be? Because we had fucking trading cards.
For the kids.
The AP reported in 1991, quote, the men and machines of the Persian Gulf War have been turned into collector's items by the same people who helped Mickey Mantle and Hank Aaron worth saving. Baseball card producer Topps has distributed millions of the new Operation Desert Storm cards, which showed stealth fighters and Patriot missiles, President Bush, and General Norman Schwarzkopf. As soon as the word was out, people were asking for them, said Larry Robbins, owner of Candle Coins and Stamps. There's been a high demand, real high demand. Robbins' first shipment of 1,728 card sets was gone within 4 days, and he's ordered more. Unquote.
God bless America.
I mean, it didn't stop with trading cards. Quoting now from an abstract of an article titled, A Geographer Looks at Desert Storm's Trading Cards, quote, material culture enthusiastically reflected the overwhelming public support for Operation Desert Shield, i.e. the military buildup, and Desert Storm, the military offensive. Merchandise ran the gamut from t-shirts, bumper stickers, pins, commemorative plates, mugs, yellow ribbons, and American flags to marquees, billboards, Saddam Hussein dart games, video games. A 29-cent stamp commemorating the successful military operation was also released by the U.S. Postal Service. In these and many more diverse forms, the Persian Gulf War ephemerally became ubiquitous on the American landscape, unquote. America was fired up for this war thing. We were in it to fucking win it, and there was no way in hell after all this time, all this money, and all this merch, there wasn't gonna be a payoff. I mean, Saddam Hussein could have literally crawled out of Kuwait on his hands and knees, beating his back with reeds and wailing in atonement for his sins. And those tanks, they were gonna fucking roll. The budget was spent, the cameras were in place, the actors were in possession, and by fucking God, we were gonna have a fucking war. Fortunately for Bush and for America, Saddam Hussein was just as stupid, vainglorious, and power-mad as he was 12 years later, and the deadline of January 15th, 1991 arrived with Iraqi forces still in Kuwait and the world holding its breath to see what would happen. The first day passed, and CNN was edging so hard you could see pre-cum all over the camera lens. And as the second day slipped into night, Wolf Blitzer's groans of climax had to be stifled by biting his lip so hard it was becoming bloody. How much longer could Bush hold back? When will that big old red, white, and blue nut gonna bust all over the faces of the world?
I'm coming.
We were waiting, and waiting until finally, yes! Oh my God, fucking yes! At 2:45 a.m. Baghdad time, the United States Air Force shot webs of sticky jizz on the upturned faces of CNN reporters. Well, technically, they just launched a smart bomb bukkake all over Iraq. And that is where we will pick it up next week for part 2 of Operation Desert Storm. So, hold on. I'll go get a towel and we'll clean you up a little bit.
Hit pause on whatever you're listening to and hit play on your next adventure. Stay 2 nights and get a $50 Best Western gift card. Life's a trip. Make the most of it at Best Western. Visit bestwestern.com for complete terms and conditions.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Buying a car shouldn't eat up your week. That's why Carvana made it convenient. Car buying that fits around your life, not the other way around. You can get pre-qualified for an auto loan in just a couple of minutes and browse thousands of quality car options, all within your terms, all online, all on your schedule. Turn car buying into a few clicks and not a full week's endeavor. Finance and buy your car at your convenience on Carvana. Financing subject to credit approval. Additional terms and conditions may apply.
Ray-Ban Meta glasses are powered by Meta AI, so you can get real-time answers.
Hey, Meta, how bougie is Jade Garden?
It's a trendy spot.
What's a color that pairs with this top?
Consider dark, earthy colors, charcoal or black.
What are some good first date topics?
Consider discussing favorite travel destinations or your favorite books.
Get suggestions, inspiration, and answers from your glasses. Ray-Ban Meta glasses. Iconic style meets Meta AI.
Were used alongside the long-range Tomahawks.
This is on the front end of the weapon itself.
This is the SRAM missile with a camera in its nose striking a hardened hangar. The first missile in this attack goes straight home. A second, however, wobbles before locking back onto its target and a devastating hit. General Schwarzkopf took particular pride in the precision with which his military could hit what they wanted, while not hitting people involved in non-military pursuits.
I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq on this particular day. Keep your eye on the crosshairs. Right there. Look at here. Right through the crosshairs. And now in his rearview mirror.
So I've mentioned before about my traumatization as a kid by cinematic violence.
You big baby.
I'm 53 years old, and sometimes I still think about that stupid flying silver ball with a spike on it from Phantasm.
Phantasm. The delusion of a disordered mind. A phantom. A spirit. A ghost. For nearly 4 decades it has been contained. But evil always has a way of breaking free.
What a great idea, having a 10-year-old watch that. Or how about the time I spent all of Jaws with my head in the popcorn bucket? So, what I'm saying is, unlike many men of my generation, I was never a fan of the slasher flick.
You're a wussy little fraidy cat.
Not at all. I like to think of myself as a pragmatist. All those teens running around in the woods with the girls. You never catch me in that situation.
Still afraid of girls.
No, okay, I was at the time, but not now. What I mean was, it just seemed to me that if I found myself in a situation where a masked lunatic with a machete was trying to kill me, running screaming through the woods might not be the ideal way to deal with the problem. I rather assume that stealth is a far better option, and I would never ever stop to make out on a back road if there was so much as a rumor of masked lunatics killing teens in the vicinity. Now, this reticence for blood only applied to the horror genre. I had no problems at all seeing blood, gore, gruesome deaths in different milieus. Watching a dude get run through with a 6-foot broadsword, spewing blood everywhere while screaming out his death throes.
That's fucking awesome!
Seeing some poor schlub getting blown apart by logically dubious applications of rockets or bombs.
I want to see this again. Rewind.
It was fucking awesome.
Killed by gunshot, stabbed with knives, choked to death by garrote, pushed off the side of a building, car crash with a gasoline fire, and someone running screaming out of the wreckage engulfed in flames? Shit, yeah. Give me that kind of violence. Put it right in my fucking veins. That's the shit I paid this $5 to get into this movie in the first place. I mean, this shit could really happen. Someone really could get pulled down by a pack of lions and eaten alive on the plains of the Serengeti.
Bambi, The Lion King, Saw 7.
I love that kind of thing because it could be real, but it isn't. Kind of like that Faces of Death movie. But all of that being true, I did not then and do not now want to watch real people die on television because I am not a monster. Which brings me to the show topic for this week, Operation Desert Storm. Or rather, the shooty part of the war. As the air attacks began, CNN cut away instantly to the reporters on the ground in Baghdad. Specifically, they were in the Al Rashid Hotel in beautiful downtown Baghdad. Located just 5 kilometers outside the city center of Baghdad, the Al Rashid provided luxury accommodations for 18 floors of sumptuous living, with rooftop vistas overlooking the command and control facilities of the Iraqi armed forces. The Al Rashid provides breathtaking views of the air combat in the skies over Baghdad. Residents can sip beverages poolside, while the whole might of the Western world rains high explosives on residential districts, hospitals, and occasionally a military outpost. The Al Rashid, where CNN watches the war. Some of those reports from the front lines were downright amusing, including this one where Bernard Shaw openly admits he was hiding under a table during a sweep by the Iraqi military.
Thank you, Peter. Just to explain to our viewers why you did not hear from us for a nervously long time. For the past 20 minutes, I've been hiding under a table, and what happened was the security people made a sweep. They got very upset that there were 3 mortals on this floor, and just 3 men standing in a hotel room. So I scampered to hide to make sure that if they pulled Arnett and Holloman out and took them downstairs into custody, at least there would still be one CNN person on the air. John?
Yep, you heard that right. Bernie Shaw was hiding just in case the other reporters were arrested.
When danger reared its ugly head, he bravely turned his tail and fled.
Now, I should take a minute to talk about the air war, commanded by my dad's direct supervisor, Lieutenant General Charles Chuck Horner.
Was he nice?
To my dad? Oh, yeah, sure, it was great. Had him over for dinner a couple of times. To the Iraqis, yeah, not so much.
They are the enemy.
Chuck planned and executed a flawless air campaign. Credit where credit is due. I mean, it was against the Iraqis, who had the best air defenses that 1972 can buy, and their pilots were not trained in modern combat techniques. And while technically they had combat experience, it was against the Iranian Air Force, who not top guns for all, they had a couple of F-14s, but still, flawless campaign. They went up against the most modern Air Force in the entire world, and it was,
It's like shooting fish in a barrel.
Shit, not even that many planes ever got off the ground. I mean, they were destroyed by cruise missiles while still in their hangars. The air defense network was good, again by 1972 standards, but in 1991, when the U.S. Air Force had months to digitally map the network via recon flights far out of range of their weapons, the results of the first night and all the subsequent nights were predictable.
Blew up.
Yeah, blew up real good. And on top of that, stealth fighters with the Iraqis had zero defense against slipped over the border ahead of everyone else and just fucked everything up that might be capable of shooting down a coalition aircraft. All that was left on the ground were a few machine guns and some shoulder-fired missiles, which is why the Scud Studs had such a good light show over Baghdad. This left the Iraqis with very few options to respond, so they pulled out their feared superweapon, the dreaded Scud missile.
All right, Scud the school, dude.
The Soviet-designed Scud missile. Well, in this case, it was actually the Iraqi version called the Al Hussein.
His name is Al.
Yeah, I mean, actually, when you think about it, it does sound like a guy you know from work. But in this case, it was probably named after Saddam. These Scuds were a very short-range missile, just over 400 miles, mounted on mobile launchers, and they could theoretically be equipped with conventional chemical or nuclear warheads. They were not very good missiles, mind you. A GPS-guided cruise missile could be dropped on a specific parking spot in an Applebee's parking lot.
Oh my goddamn fucking space!
A Scud on a good night might hit the town where the Applebee's was located. Still, use what you have, and Iraqi lobbed some Scuds at targets in Saudi Arabia, including the base where my dad was stationed, so he was shot at. But those Scuds were quickly and easily shot down. More to come on that in a moment. More inconveniently, however, several Scuds were lobbed at Israel, which posed a huge problem for the coalition because Israel had been kept very specifically out of this whole war thing against Iraq. Without getting into the diplomatic weeds, Israel retaliating against Iraq for those Scuds would be, to put it mildly,
Problematic?
Yeah. You see, the Arab nations in the coalition were very specific about not wanting Israel in the war, since they had all had their asses kicked by Israel on multiple occasions, and they were still in their feelings about that. So, the United States had to do something about it, and that's where we bring out the
Patriot missile.
Correct.
One of the stars of the war. The Patriots were able to intercept incoming missiles and destroy them before they hit their target. It wasn't a particularly new technology. It was just the first time we'd seen it before, and TV news loved them. They just seemed so technological. There were already Patriots in Saudi Arabia, so they were rushed over to Israel, where they shot down the sporadic Scuds that went towards Israel for the rest of the war. God, TV loved the gadgets of this war. Stealth fighters, Patriot missiles, and most of all,
smart bomb, stupid bomb.
The smart bomb. We've all gotten used now to seeing the grainy green footage of crosshairs on some building and seeing it suddenly go white as the bomb in the building. And incidentally, everyone inside the building suddenly ceased to exist. But in 1991, no one outside of a secure facility on a military base had ever seen anything like it. And the news loved to show the fucking clips of these precision strikes.
Me to the south.
Laser coming on. Got the laser on. Holding the track and steady on the far corner. Roger.
Hey, call sign, calling back.
Good. 10 seconds.
Shell 4-1, I've got to tell you, I think that's wedged to the south.
4, 3, 2,
I'm at my position
1.
for about 10 miles.
The impact. Boom! Oh, yes!
And oh, did the military love to show them to us, complete with their spiels about how incredibly accurate the bombs are. They had one purported to be a bomb going in an open window. You couldn't sit down for dinner without half a dozen of these every fucking night on the news for weeks on end. Because there's nothing like enjoying your nice steak dinner while watching the high-tech equivalent of a snuff film. Because you just watched a bunch of people die, right? I mean, we weren't dropping bombs on empty buildings. We were dropping bombs on buildings with actual human beings in them. That was kind of the point. Yeah, they were the enemy, but they were still like, human beings, not computer-generated pixels, but sentient creatures with parents, wives, children's dreams, hopes, things like that. And yeah, they might be the bad guys, but most were probably just someone who needed a job or more likely got drafted to fight in a war they didn't want to be part of. But hey, enjoy your dinner and your war movies.
But you are an epic buzzkill.
Now, this has all been pretty one-sided, this whole war thing, which was to be expected since one side is so very much more powerful than the other. But never let it be said Iraq didn't try to get their licks in. On January 29th, 1991, around 2,000 Iraqi soldiers, supported by a couple hundred vehicles, including light armor, swarmed across the Saudi border into the town of Khafji. U.S. air recon saw all of this going down, but I guess the generals were too busy watching snuff videos to take it seriously and do anything about it. The Iraqis overwhelmed the small forces stationed in the town as a screening force and quickly occupied it. And then other Iraqi forces were put in motion to support and expand this little offensive. Because those forces coming to reinforce the town, they were swarmed over by American planes like wasp on a watermelon. Quoting now from AirAndSpaceForces.com, quote, pilots found the Iraqi armored vehicles easy to identify once they were on the move. Near Al-Wafra, an A-10 pilot described the sight of a column of vehicles as something like from A-10 schools. A-6 intruders from the Navy joined in using Rockeye air-to-ground weapons. A-10 pilot Captain Rob Gibbons later recalled with some amazement, I, myself, one captain and one airplane, was engaging up to a battalion size of armor on the ground and keeping those guys pinned for a little bit. Air Force AC-130 gunships waiting on alert were scrambled after a hasty briefing. As lead elements of the 5th Mechanized with some support from the 3rd Armor reached Khafji, one Air Force gunship caught the column and stopped many of them from entering the town, unquote. Within 48 hours, the Iraqis retreated. They left hundreds killed, hundreds more captured, and almost all their armor destroyed. Coalition forces lost 43 people, almost all of them to friendly fire. One of the sad but bitterly true facts about the Gulf War is the biggest danger to our troops over there were our other troops. 4 weeks, coalition forces flew uncontested over Iraq, blowing shit up, hunting for scuds, and just generally having a fucking ball.
It's equally important to have fun.
I cannot tell you how many pilots I spoke to after the war who flew in this Desert Storm that flat out bragged about how much fun they were having after the first few days, just zipping off to blow up a building or drop bombs on troop positions and then flying back to base in time to watch their exploits on fucking CNN. But alas, air power alone wasn't going to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait.
Hell, where would the fun in that be?
To get them and their boys to take their toys and go home, it would take, in the words of Saddam Hussein, the mother of all battles. And on February 24th, 1991, it began. 100 hours later, it was over. Spoiler alert, the Iraqis lost. I mean, it wasn't even close. I could spend the next 20 minutes talking about the Great Deception, how we kept attention focused on marine amphibious landings in Kuwait, or how Storm and Norman made it look like the main assault was going to come from the south, when in reality, he was going to do his famous left hook and take the enemy in flank with a massive armor column. But I don't need to. I can let Storm and Norman explain it just himself in like 2 minutes.
We continued our heavy operations out in the sea because we wanted the Iraqis to continue to believe that we were going to conduct a massive amphibious operation in this area. And I think many of you recall the number of amphibious rehearsals we had, to include Imminent Thunder, that was written about quite extensively for many reasons. But we continued to have those operations because we wanted him to concentrate his forces, which he did. I think this is probably one of the most important parts of the entire briefing I could talk about. As you know, very early on, we took out the Iraqi Air Force. We knew that he had very, very limited reconnaissance means, and therefore when we took out his Air Force, for all intents and purposes, we took out his ability to see what we were doing down here in Saudi Arabia. Once we had taken out his eyes, we did what could best be described as the Hail Mary play in football. I think you recall when the quarterback is desperate for a touchdown at the very end, what he does is he steps up behind the center, and all of a sudden every single one of his receivers goes way out to one flank, and they all run down the field as fast as they possibly can and into the end zone, and he lobs the ball. In essence, that's what we did. When we knew that he couldn't see us anymore, we did a massive movement of troops all the way out to the west, to the extreme west, because at that time we knew that he was still fixed in this area with the vast majority of his forces, and once the air campaign started, he would be incapable of moving out to counter this move, even if he knew we made it.
I would never go so far as to say that the battle for Kuwait was one-sided, because that would imply that the Iraqi army actually fought back. No, that's not what happened. They just unassed the area as quickly as possible. Infamously, they loaded everything that wasn't nailed down and a few things that were nailed down, if they could find a hammer, on anything that could roll, and fled Kuwait as fast as they could fucking go. A massive column of fleeing Iraqis spilled out into the open and was promptly slaughtered by coalition air power. Quoting from Wikipedia, quote, "The Highway of Death is a 6-lane highway between Kuwait and Iraq, officially known as Highway 80. I've driven on it myself. It runs from Kuwait City to the border town of Safwan in Iraq, and then on to the Iraqi city of Basra. During the American-led coalition offensive into the Persian Gulf War, American, Canadian, British, and French aircraft and ground forces attacked retreating Iraqi military personnel attempting to leave Kuwait on the night of February 26th to 27th, 1991, resulting in the destruction of hundreds of vehicles and the deaths of many of their occupants. Between 1,400 and 2,000 vehicles were hit or abandoned on the main Highway 80 north of Al-Jahara. The death toll from the attack remains unknown. British journalist Robert Fisk said he lost count of Iraqi corpses crammed into the smoldering wreckage or slumped face down on the sand at the main site, and saw hundreds of corpses strewn up and down the road all the way to the Iraqi border. American journalist Bob Drogan reported seeing scores of dead soldiers in and around vehicles, mangled and bloated in the drifting desert stands. A 2003 study by the Project on Defense Alternative estimated fewer than 10,000 people rode in the cut-off main caravan, and when the bombing started, most simply left their vehicles to escape through the desert or into nearby swamps, or maybe some died from their wounds and some were later taken prisoner. According to the PDA, the often repeated low estimate of the numbers killed in the attack is 200 to 300, reported by journalist Michael Calley, who personally counted 37 bodies, but a minimum death toll, or at least 500 or 600, seems more plausible, unquote. Plausible, huh? Yeah, okay. Those numbers, almost certainly laughably low. Upper estimates put the death toll in the thousands. I personally was told some 5 years later by a Kuwaiti officer who had firsthand knowledge of the situation that at least 10,000 people were killed on the highway of death because the Kuwaitis were the ones that had to fucking bury them all. The entire highway of death is quite likely a war crime. I know because it was called one at the time. These were not active combatants. They were running for their lives. And on top of that, there were almost certainly civilians in the column. But hey, so long as everyone was having fun.
No harm, no foul.
And the whole thing was just sort of smoothed over in a feel-good post-war nut buzz that just swept the entire world. Again, except for, the Iraqis. The war was over, the good guys won. Kuwait was back in Kuwaiti hands. Admittedly, most of it was on fire because the Iraqis blew up all the oil wells because the Iraqis were, in fact, actual assholes. I know I've been super critical of the good old U.S. of America, but it should be noted the Iraqis did do a lot of terrible things themselves, not the least of which was invade Kuwait in the first place, which caused this whole fucking thing to happen. But the important thing is America won. It won decisively, and most of all, it won quickly. No decade-long slog toward a negotiated withdrawal, just a lightning offensive, a clear defeat, and the shooting was over. Did a few people grouse about us not going all the way and removing Saddam Hussein from power?
Oh boy, did they.
But as Poppy Bush pointed out, the UN said to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait. It said nothing about occupying Iraq. Also, come on, if they got rid of Saddam, who was going to be our boogeyman? Russia was done for. Iran was reeling from a decade of war with Iraq, and North Korea, well, Kim Jong-il was too busy making movies and drinking all the imported scotch he could get his hands on. So they needed Saddam in power to make sure military spending didn't drop too far. If we'd removed Saddam from power in 1991, who the fuck were we going to have a war with for the next decade? Which, hey, we did. Nah, keeping Saddam in power was more about the forever war than any sort of UN resolution. I don't care what the fuck George H.W. Bush said. As early as March, they began bringing the boys home. And the girls. Should point out that there were women over in the Persian Gulf. In fact, I read an interesting tidbit while researching the show that, like, by a factor of 10 to 1, more people got pregnant while in the Persian Gulf for Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, the people who were actually deployed there, than all the people we lost in the war. So for every American that died in the war, there were 10 babies conceived during the operation. There was a lot of fucking going on in the AOR. There was at least 10, maybe 20 new divorces. Trust me, I know. When I got back stateside in 92, I saw all of them. It was a very good time for me because there were a lot of angry wives back there. What was I talking about? Oh, right. Homecomings. Yes, exactly. We live in a world where thanking someone for their services obligatory, unless you mean thanking for their services with things like meaningful medical care or assistance reacclimating to civilian life or dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. But let's not get crazy here. But it was nothing like what happened in 1991. Not since World War II had returning GIs seen such an overwhelming expression of thanks and gratitude. American flags, yellow ribbons festooned every fucking thing. If you showed up in a uniform, you could not get anyone to take your money for anything. I mean, within reasons. We're talking like a meal at Denny's, not like a new car. It was great, but not that great. You sure as hell didn't pay for drinks. If you had a chocolate chip Desert BDU on, people bought you drinks, even if you spent your war in air-conditioned comfort far beyond Scud range. And good God, could you get laid? Even ugly guys were getting pussy thrown on them like a ticker tape parade. And speaking of parades, everywhere had a fucking parade. This is from the Orlando Sentinel on one in Tavares, Florida, population 9,500. Quote, A pilot shot down during the Persian Gulf War and a fellow flyer who led a mission to rescue him will take center stage this weekend as Lake County celebrates the end of the war and honors hundreds of their own who served in it. 2 other servicemen who gained national recognition during the World War will be on hand, along with as many as 80 Lake County men and women who returned from Operation Desert Storm. They will take part in a parade in downtown Tavares. The parade will be the largest ever in the county, organizers say, surpassing every centennial parades in 1987. The parade has now more than 300 units, said Horan, an organizer. We've got veterans groups, floats, civic clubs, fire departments, mayors, baseball teams, cheerleaders, and high school bands. We have everything. While Tavares, because it is the county seat, is hosting the parade, the event is a county-wide celebration. Units from cities' unincorporated communities throughout Lake County have been entered in the parade, unquote. But it was in Washington, D.C., where the biggest parade of them all, the biggest since the end of World War II, celebrated America's heroes.
Good evening. Well, already they are saying tonight it was the biggest military celebration in the nation's capital since World War II, as Washington today honored the U.S. servicemen and women who fought in the Gulf War, both those who returned and those who died. 200,000 enthusiastic spectators watched a parade of troops and their weapons, all part of the National Victory Celebration.
It was glorious. Tanks rolling down Pennsylvania avenues, flybys, so many flags for all those goddamn heroes who bombed an ill-prepared Air Force for a couple of weeks and fought 100 hours of utterly lopsided combat at the cost of 96 coalition deaths in combat and 105 coalition deaths in non-combat. The Iraqis lost between 150,000 and 350,000 people all told. They did not get a parade. All that feel good did not feel good for very long. George H.W. Bush's approval ratings had topped 85% in the weeks following the war and started a long slide from there, bottoming out at 29% a year after his big parade. The economy faltered, people were losing jobs. Oddly enough, people in the military lost biggest of all. After our big win in the Cold War and Desert Storm, there was a steep drawdown in our armed forces. After all, who was left to fight? There was a new world order now.
Ooh, sounds scary.
No.
And there's no need for such a huge military. I mean, we still had a fucking huge military, but we could cut out the dead weight, I guess. I mentioned last week that my dad got fucked out because of his participation in the war. He eventually took a severance package after not making promotion to major, so a pilot somewhere could be promoted out of flying and transferred into a desk job that my dad used to do. So I guess both of them lost because both of them hated it. Tens of thousands of active duty people took packages like this, some happily, some, like my dad, out of no other real choice. He left the military, a job that he loved, and wound up an assistant manager at a fucking Walmart. The country entered a recession at the same time as the war was going on, which no one noticed with all the cool bombings on TV. It wasn't even a particularly bad recession by all standards, but it was brief, and it was just long enough to tank Poppy's re-election efforts so he would lose to Bill Clinton in 1992. So I guess my dad wasn't the only one that lost a job in this fucking stupid war. And that vibe of I love the military was also really fucking short-lived. By the end of 1991, there were no more yellow ribbon discounts at Denny's, no more sloppy blowjobs for our boys in uniform, and you're damn sure buying your own drinks in the bar. The afterglow of orgiastic military destruction was as short as the war itself. By the time I got back from Korea in the December of 91, the only sign the whole thing even happened were some faded yellow ribbons tied around the old oak trees, a few war trophy Russian tanks on static place on military bases, and all the good officers and sergeants were gone. They took those buyouts, just like my dad, and left the suck-ups, brown-nosers, and career-focused assholes in charge. No one gave a runny shit if you were in the military or not. Here's your full-price moons over my hammy, asshole.
You sound bitter.
Do I? I mean, it's not for me, not really. I set out the war drinking and playing soldier in the cold wet of Korea. No one ever shot scuds at me, and I didn't have to wear a chemical protective suit in desert temperatures. But it was, and I am, bitter for my dad. He loved being in the military. It was his life. It was just my job. And I'm bitter for what all of this bullshit set up to happen. we spent the next decade in the Persian Gulf deterring Iraqi aggression, all the while stoking the hatred of various religious factions against Americans for occupying the holy land of Islam. I mean, yeah, they were going to find something to be angry about if we weren't there, but our being there made it so fucking easy. I did my tour in the sandbox in 1996 after a massive truck bomb exploded outside an Air Force barracks in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. Killed 19, injured 400. That caused a massive exodus of all the people in Saudi Arabia way out of the middle of nowhere so we could be safe, and that told the terrorists they could hurt us enough to make us flinch, and they started planning for something that would really make us flinch. 5 years later, we flinched. Real fucking hard. I'm bitter because we ended up going back to war in Iraq to finish what we started, or because Saddam tried to kill W's daddy. I'm bitter because this quick, easy, relatively bloodless war, I mean, on our side anyway, made us believe that our 2003 invasion would be another rerun of that feel-good war from 1991, kind of like Cheers or something. Funny how the war that came after the war that wasn't going to be like Vietnam turned out to be a whole fucking lot like Vietnam. I'm bitter that it made people think war was more like a video game or a movie special effect than what it is. Highly organized, super efficient murder on the one hand, and on the other hand, a chaotic shitstorm of mud, blood, and death on the other. All because it was so good for ratings, for cable fucking news. You know what? In a just world, we would have emptied out CNN Center in Atlanta and sent one of those super accurate fucking smart bombs through the window into the studio. Everyone would have been fine. Bernard Shaw could have taught everyone how to cover underneath a table.
Get your mother-loving ears on because your big-time radio DJ's got news. PayPal lets you choose how you want to pay for all the stuff. With PayPal, I can pay in-store, pay online, or pay over time. What's that? You want this translated into song? I hope you're sitting down. You can pay your own way. You keep those ears on, you hear? Don't just pay, baby. PayPal.
Learn more at paypal.com.
This episode is brought to you by Dogfish Head Craft Brewery. The Grateful Dead and Dogfish Head have gotten the band back together with the release of Grateful Dead Juicy Pale Ale, a light-body pale ale brewed with sustainable Kernza grains, granola, and heaps of good karma for a refreshing brew that's music to your taste buds. Available nationwide. Visit dogfish.com to find Grateful Dead Juicy Pale Ale in your neck of the woods. Dogfish Head Craft Brewery is located in Milton, Delaware. Please drink responsibly.
That is it for our show this week. Well, there you go. Operation Desert Storm in a nutshell. What, were you looking for some sort of play-by-play action of all the battles and in-depth analysis of economic and political underpinnings of the 1990s to better understand the motivation of the actors? Yeah, I was too, but it turns out most of the available research material is about the 2003 Iraq War. I don't have the budget for deep dives. And honey, how that works out, Jeremy. Still, even if I did have a good research material, I would have done the dick jokes anyway, because they're the lowest common denominator. Speaking of the lowest common denominator, rate and review this show wherever you get your podcast. Helps others find us and be brought down to the lowest common denominator podcasting, just like you are now. If you like what we do for some reason, kick us $1 on patreon.com/whatthehellpodcast, just like Stephen W. and Brian Scooby Sexclusion did this month. Thank you both. You're both official What the Hell Podcast pod pals. And if you ever see producer Gavin in person, you can legally force him to rub your feet. Now, you need to do all the things Jeremy tells you to do in the closing credits. Otherwise, he will have no choice but to put you in his podcasting crosshairs and launch a withering denunciation of your failure to follow simple instructions. You want to avoid that. It's quite cutting. I should know. He made me cry once. No, he didn't. Jeremy would never do that. And so for me, Dave, it came in through the bathroom window, Bledsoe. Producer.
And then the whole building just went boom.
Gavin, and all the fictional people in buildings that don't want to get blown up. We want to say, why didn't anybody tell them? Why didn't anybody see that a small country like Iraq going to war with a superpower was going to end badly for them? Jesus, I feel bad for these guys. And we'll see you all next week.
She worked at 15 clubs a day. And though she thought I knew the answer, well, I knew, but I could not say. And so I quit the police department and got myself a steady job. And though she tried her best to help me.
What the Hell Were You Thinking stars Dave Bledsoe and features Gavin St. James and several fictional minions. The show is produced by Kimberly Steele and a part of the Seltzer Kings podcast network. You can find more information on the show on their website, whatthehellpodcast.com, or on Twitter at @thehell_podcast, or on Facebook as What the Hell Podcast. Thanks for listening.
I have no ending for this, so I take a small bow.
If the Ayatollah can't have it, no one can.
Seltzer Kings
Podcasts.